Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is noon, so I am going to get started because we have a lot of content. I think folks are still going to be signing on, which is all right. So, good afternoon again. Thank you for joining us today for our first session of our Creating and Sustaining Inclusive Community series. My name is Brianna Miranda, and I'm one of the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan's Education and Outreach Coordinators. Joining me today is Lindsay Owens. They are also a Fair Housing West Michigan Education and Outreach Coordinator. And additionally, we have Tyler Oxt of MSU Extension. Tyler is a government and community vitality educator for Southwest Michigan with MSU Extension and the Michigan Sea Grant. It focuses on land use. He focuses on land use, zoning, planning, and community development. If some of you joined us last year, Tyler did join us for our Fair Housing and Housing Development series that we had in 2024. This was more geared toward developers and zoning and planning professionals. If you are interested in that series, you can find that on our website. We had some recordings and materials that are made available. We are so happy to have him again to join us for this series. So thank you, Tyler. This series is covers a very important topic as we hope to focus on empowering community members with information to work towards more inclusive and fair communities. So before I start us off today, we do have some housekeeping things, and which I will go over. I will provide, so I'll go over that housekeeping stuff. I'll provide an overview of who we are as the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan and what is fair housing. Then I'll turn it over to Tyler, who will go over zoning, planning, and land use. And then last but not least, Lindsay will end our time together, kind of diving a little bit deeper on the connection between fair housing and zoning and planning. So for some housekeeping things, all attendees are muted and your cameras are off, so we cannot see or hear you. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A. We'll answer clarifying questions about the content during the session. However, we'll have more time at the end for detailed questions. Evaluations should come up into your browser and will be there when the webinar ends. Please fill that out. Just a note, as some folks attend a lot of our trainings, no certificates will be available for this training. So it's just the evaluation. In addition, this session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you have to head out early or anything, you won't miss anything because it'll be recorded, which is really great. So here's some information for the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. That is the Education Outreach extension there, 30. So if you want to reach us, you can do extension 30, our Facebook, LinkedIn, and then mine and Lindsay's contact information. So as I mentioned, this series really is aiming to empower community members with practical information to work towards more inclusive and fair communities. And we are able to bring this series as a generous grant support from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We will have a second session, so if you're not already registered, there is information provided in the handouts or in the presentation. You can click that link and I'll take you to the registration. That'll be on June 5th at the same time. That one will also be recorded. So if you can't attend, but you want the recording, feel free to register to get that as soon as it's posted. So to dive in here, who is the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan? We are a private nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 1980 as a collaboration between the community and the housing industry. Our mission is to prevent and eliminate illegal housing discrimination, to ensure equal housing opportunity, and to promote inclusive communities. We do this through various ways, but the two main ways is through education and advocacy. Education like today, educating the community, and educating housing the industry, and then advocacy and enforcement, where we take complaints of housing discrimination and advocate on our clients' behalf. Just a few disclaimers here. The Fair Housing Center of West Michigan does not have any attorneys on staff, so we cannot provide legal advice. And any information that we provide is for educational purposes only, and all the information is current and to the best of our knowledge. However, it can change at any time. So, why does this all matter? Because where you live really affects how you live. So, housing is so important, so central there, and that image there, it really connects us to every aspect of our lives. So, it's really important that housing is free from discrimination. And so, that's why it's really important to our work because of the connection to our wealth, to our health, to education, and to jobs. There are other fair housing centers within Michigan. So that is our service coverage area there. So you can always call our office, and if we don't support or if we don't serve your area, we will just give you the information for the other fair housing centers in the state. So there's a lot of things that come with our name that folks often think we do. That we do. However, we do not do a lot of things. You can review some of the things on the slide here. However, we really just focus on fair housing and housing discrimination, which I'll go into, but we don't do any of the other things kind of connected with housing. So, what is fair housing? Fair housing is the right to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination, and these are based on protected classes under federal, state, and local laws. I'll go into what those protected classes are on the next slide here. But however, fair housing laws do protect against discrimination in any type of housing transaction. So many folks think of it in the rental and sales arena. However, as we'll be going over today, it does protect for land use and zoning decisions as well. So, what are these protected classes? So, there's different buckets, as mentioned by the different laws. So, at the federal level, we have race, skin color, religion, sex, disability status, both mental and physical disabilities, familial status, which is the presence of children under the age of 18 in the home, and national origin and where somebody is from. There are additional protections for HUD-funded housing. I won't go into that, but those are there. And then at the state level, we have all the federal protected classes plus some additions. So we have marital status, which includes whether or not somebody is married, widowed, divorced, or single. Age, so over the age of 18, or you can enter a legal contract. There are some exceptions for senior housing, so 52 and older, or sorry, not 52, 62 and older, and 55 and older housing. So those are the only exceptions for the age protection. Additionally, we have an expanded definition on race. Race in the state of Michigan also includes hair texture and protective hairstyles that are historically associated with race. Sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, and then additionally, which is new, source of income protections, however, that's only covered in rental housing. And then at the local level, it depends. It really depends on where you live and your city if they have additional protections. So making sure that you're aware of the protections within your community. You can check out where to find that information on those two links. You can also just reach out to your locality and ask if they have additional fair housing ordinances or protections as well. So what is covered? Fair housing laws prohibit discrimination in dwellings. What is a dwelling? It is a building or structure that is occupied, designed, or intended for occupancy. However, it also includes vacant land, which is intended for occupancy. So that's where zoning and land use kind of come in to that definition. Is it's not just the structure, it's that land that is also intended for housing. And the Fair Housing Act prohibits municipalities and other local entities from making zoning or land use decisions that would exclude or discriminate against individuals by a protected class. It can be intentional or it can have a discriminatory effect, which means that they based on the zoning decision, it may be facially neutral. However, there is an adverse impact on a particular group that causes them harm, and it's generally by the perpetuation of segregation. So there is some things, and Lindsay will dive in a little bit deeper on that toward the end of that toward that, to see that connection. It also requires municipalities, the Fair Housing Act, municipalities and local governments to make reasonable accommodations to zoning and land use for people with disabilities. So if a person needs an accommodation, we have an example here. If a zoning board wants to grant an accommodation to designate a group of individuals with disabilities to live together in a group home as a family, to allow for more unrelated adults in a single family home than normally permitted under zoning restrictions. So there may be zoning restrictions that say, only so many people can live in this space, but this home is for individuals with disabilities, so they can request that accommodation and live together, and kind of that zoning restriction no longer applies to them because of that protection. So that is just a kind of intro to kind of that connection between zoning and land use and fair housing. Lindsay will cover a little bit more toward the end of the training, but now I'm going to turn it over to Tyler, who will kind of go over more in depth on planning and zoning and kind of give you that baseline knowledge before we dive too deeper and with that knowledge. So I will now stop my share and turn it over to Tyler.
Thank you, Bree, as all of my windows fly around as I get my own sharing started now. So hopefully everybody's seeing that opening slide on a planning and zoning primer. Again,
Looks
just quick
good.
reminder, if you don't know me, my name's Tyler Auks. Thanks for that verification out there. I'm a government community vitality educator with Michigan State University Extension. So lots of words there. All it really means is for the university and extension, I provide training, outreach, education on a lot of local government issues. Planning and zoning is kind of my bread and butter, where I spend a lot of time, but also other issues about making communities where people want to live, work, and play. Of course, this is an MSU extension program, so we are open to all. Just want to lift that up as I start my presentation. If ever at any point you're having issues accessing our extension materials, please let me know. You can do that by reaching out. My contact information is here on the slide. I've got a map for around the state of other folks similar to me doing the same kind of work that you can reach out to, because extension is meant to be that resource in your backyard, bringing the knowledge and resources of the university to our Michigan communities. The content I'm going to go over today was initially written by one of my predecessors, so want to acknowledge that author and retired professional with extension. If you're in Northern Michigan, might be a familiar name to you, but great content here that we can provide, because really the emphasis behind our primer here on planning and zoning is we know that these zoning decisions are happening. Land use change is happening around us. But if the public is going to effectively participate, shape the outcome of these decisions, you need to have that basic understanding of planning and zoning to really engage in the process. So hopefully today and with the next session, we can give you that basic understanding. My time with you today is going to cover starting with why we plan, the planning and zoning, move through that process and how it gets implemented, and then end with a bit of a discussion on the zoning and some other places where you can get more information to do a little bit deeper of a dive or have some resources for when these decisions are happening in your community. But it all starts with why we plan. And here on this slide, we've got a great quote from Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, where, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to walk from here?" said Alice. "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. And that's the crux of planning. You need to figure out where you want to get to before you can figure out which direction you're going to walk. You need to have that goal in mind before you decide how you're going to get there. And really, we all plan time, right? Think about your daily life. This may be something that's happening subconsciously, but we do that forward thinking and start to make our plans and preparations. It might be like this morning when I realized, oh, I'm going to be on a Zoom today. I should put on a tie and look decent. Our decisions about getting dressed is planning. We make a list before we go to the grocery store. Before we cut a board, we measure it once, maybe even twice if you're real thorough before you make that cut. These are all examples of how we plan. And as you think about it, there's kind of a process you work through in your individual lives as you plan. Like if we were planning to buy a car, first we'd establish that goal to have this new car or to buy a new car every 2 years. And then we can start to figure out which direction we're going to walk, what policies we're going to put in place. We could start setting some savings goals. We can then fine to or put that fine point on it with a strategy. We have this much monthly income, so this is how we're going to get to that savings. And then we can take the action. Once we've got those policies in place, we are saving, then we research, test drive, and eventually select and buy the car we want. But it all starts with setting that plan, establishing that goal. And local governments do a similar sort of process. So when governments plan for their vision or their goals, where they want to be, there are some differences to how we do it in our everyday life. The first is the government, so it needs to be done openly, transparently. Here in Michigan, we have our Open Meetings Act. More trainings from MSU Extension are available on that, but we're in a democracy, right? We have to do this out in the open. We have to include many people, bring stakeholders, residents in. There's also a formal process for planning and a formal adoption that occurs. And at the bottom of this slide, you see a reference to that formal process in Michigan. The Public Act PA 33 of 2008, or the Michigan Compiled Laws MCL 125.3801. Those are both references to our Michigan Planning Enabling Act. This is the state law that sets that formal process and adoption requirements for your local government's plans. You might have heard these called community plans, master plans, comprehensive plans. That's what we're talking about. All right. That's good, right? Because it all seems pretty complex, right? As we're starting to think about, okay, how do we plan? It's great because for every problem, there's one solution, which is simple, neat, and wrong. So things are going to be complicated as we go through this, and that's okay. We're dealing with humans, so complexity is expected. But planning isn't something new either. We've been doing this since before we were even a country. Some of our earliest colonies that were set up had these planned elements, setting down and deciding what the vision for the community was in New Haven or Philadelphia, or even here in Michigan and Detroit in the early 1600s, 1700s. We see this history of planning in our country, even among our founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson laying out some planned visions for Charlottesville and the University of Virginia. Because planning really helps us set that future direction of a community. If you're thinking about planning in Michigan, the Michigan Association of Planning is a great partner in this work. Lots of great resources on why we plan. They used to be known as the Michigan Society of Planning Officials. Now it's our state chapter of the American Planning Association. But it's really all about the process, thinking about what we do. That planning is so important. It impacts lives on a day-to-day basis going forward. And do it is get ahead of the change that's going to occur, whether we plan or not. The world is going to change around us. But if we plan, we can use that as a way to maximize the positives of that change while also trying to minimize the negative come out in a changing society. We also plan, because here in Michigan, you may be familiar with this, if your local community has a zoning ordinance, if they're doing zoning, that zoning is required by our state laws to be based on a plan. The plan is really the when and where decisions are made about the possible developments for the community, what we want our future to be. The plan is really what provides the rationale for local zoning ordinances and a whole host of other policies that local governments are going to implement. So when we're thinking about planning and zoning, getting involved at the planning stage is crucial because when it comes time for other decisions on the zoning side to be made, they're going to be looking at those decisions through what the master plan says, looking to that vision and goals in a master plan for guidance. So making sure that you are an active participant in the development of the plan can help make sure that your voice is heard in that goal and vision. Because as the often cited quote here that is on the slide is saying, the world is run by those who show up. So show up. And really have a should be something to make sure that planning they're including a diversity of voices on their boards, commissions, and their outreach. You make sure you're reviewing local data, figuring out who those underrepresented populations might be, and reaching out to underrepresented populations like we often see in planning decisions, women and minorities in your community. Plans are uniquely situated in the state of Michigan in that they're supposed to have a very broad representation at the local level of the community's interest. So making sure that as folks come onto boards or as we engage planning, we're getting that broad representation of interest that exists in your community. And here, this is where you get to be community experts. You're going to know the various groups that exist and how to reach out to them in the most effective way. So that's a little bit there on why we plan. It's really about setting that goal, setting the vision so that we can use it to help inform our decisions 20, 30 years into the future. And that plan, it's really a good plan is a good mix between the research, the science piece, that sort of fact book of all the tables and charts at the beginning, but then also that public opinion we get through engagement, sort of the more political piece for the community. A plan needs to have both, and it's about a balance. You want to make sure that your research and science is backed up by what folks are seeing out there in the community. Also, really encourage you to think about that public opinion piece as a way of bringing people along, building consensus by involving them in the process to really get that buy-in as we develop and adopt these master plans. And as you're thinking about that front end, the research, the science, we want to make sure we're using good research here. Make sure you have some standards for what is going to be good research that we're going to be able to base decisions on. Make sure that it's solid science. If possible, do we have peer-reviewed, maybe even double-blind? Now, uncommon a lot in community development research, but there may be areas where we can get to that gold science, our gold standard for science research. But also just checking, is it replicable? Is it unbiased researchers? Some of these key things to just make sure the facts and science we're using in our master plan are solid. Now, that master plan has some things that need to be in it under our state laws here in Michigan. The link on this slide and the materials that were sent out ahead of time include an article on what those minimum contents are. That's what a lot of our state laws do, is they really set this floor, and then communities can go above that. But at a minimum, they need to include your land use plan for the future, studies on your infrastructure, including recommendations, your plans for your blighted areas, a plan for how you're going to do your zoning ordinance if you are. But then recently, just last year, the Michigan Plan Enabling Act was amended, where it now expressly includes housing as something that needs to be included in a master plan, including planning for a variety of housing types, and also your current and forecasted housing demands and what your plans are going to be for meeting them. So that was part of a package of bills that came through in 2024 around housing. Okay, so communities plan, and then we often think of zoning next, right? Planning and zoning. But zoning is just one piece of the puzzle when it gets to that stage to implement the plan. So as you're thinking about your community and you've gone through all the work, we've talked to folks, we've had the open houses, we've done the research, we have our master plan. We know our vision for the next 20, 30 years. And now we got to figure out how are we going to get there? How are we going to implement this plan? So we'll talk in a little bit about zoning, but also want to have folks think through that zoning is really just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to implementing these master plans. Our local governments, depending on the type of government it is, has lots of different levers they can pull to sort of use their power, use their authority, use their resources towards whatever vision they want to achieve. So these can be things that we don't often think about, but the power of taxation on the other side, the power of spending that money, police power here to regulate things, and then coordination among entities are all ways that a community can implement the master plan, especially around housing goals. Some of these become really important. And so on this slide, we're just trying to open up what folks are thinking about when we go to implement a plan. Outside of editing the zoning ordinance, what are other things we can do to implement a plan? Like here on the slide, we have a whole host of examples, won't go through them all, but if there are housing goals, maybe we can use our tools of taxation to meet those. You recently passed some legislation in Michigan that allows for tax increment finance districts to be used for housing under brownfield development. So maybe we could use those sort of tax breaks, our housing goals. We can also choose how to spend money, whether to buy or not buy land, to keep land. These are expenditure decisions by a local government that can impact housing availability. And all of these should be driven by those goals set out in a master plan. Same thing with your police power ordinances. And here, yes, we have the image of a police officer, but this is police power in the terms of regulating something. So communities can do zoning ordinances as a form of a police power ordinance, but also other general ordinances do. Do you have rental ordinances or land division ordinances that may be impacting your availability of housing? And then the broader bucket of cooperation. This gets beyond what you have the authority to do sometimes, but more it's just working together, right? Who can you partner with, whether through formal partnerships or just collaborations to work together on these goals? So really, as we're doing our planning and zoning primer, yes, planning and zoning are important, but remember what you plan for, you can implement in a lot of other ways. One quick example we have is from City of Traverse City, where they planned for their downtown and did some zoning design things to make a certain look in their downtown development. But then they worked with taxation by making their downtown zoning district match their downtown development authority boundaries. And then we're able to use some of those tax incentives to help pay for downtown improvements to meet the new zoning designs that they were asking for. Another spend money example from Manistee County of how to implement a master plan. Here, they were trying to direct development to particular areas. They wanted some around this Kaliva that had an industrial park and where development was, but wanted to maintain some of their natural resources in forest areas. So as Manistee County was thinking about where to spend their road money, they made sure that those expenditures matched the vision laid out in their plans. And again, it can go to all sorts of other ordinances, whether it's a junk ordinance, sign ordinance, rental ordinances. Again, it goes back to the plan, laying out those goals and how we want to get there. And as we think about coordination, especially in the housing realm, that's one of those areas where the markets are often bigger than a single township or a single village. So thinking through, okay, how are we going to work with our neighbors, with the other key players here to make these goals? Your master plan can start to lay out that vision for coordination on these topics that really span government lines and require some sort of cooperation. In other programs, we talk a lot about natural features because a river doesn't care about your boundaries, right? Same thing with housing. The housing market doesn't care where that section line is. So making sure we're having that regional coordination can really move the needle in implementing a master plan. All right. Tyler has been talking and throwing a lot at us. It's getting a little complicated, and you're starting to think through local government, right? Okay, so we can make these plans, we can have a vision, but there's a lot of moving pieces, even in just my examples I gave, right? We talked about townships needing to work with a road commission up there in Manistee County, or thinking about parks. Who controls the parks? Maybe some are townships, some are city, maybe some are even county. There's a lot of ways that the authority government's exercise gets divided. Some of it is up on this slide. There's a lot more too, thinking about school buildings. That's a little outside of planning and zoning world, but it's important to consider as we go through this. Thinking through these things, there needs to be somebody pulling it all together, right? Trying to get these disparate areas working towards that goal that a community has identified. And really, that's what the planning process is all about, is getting towards that coordination. In Michigan, our Planning Enabling Act is really written to make sure we're notifying our neighbors about what's going on, trying to get to those bigger than just local concern issues. Thinking about what are those topics we need to discuss at a coordinated level. You're seeing the state do this through our regional housing partnerships right now that the Michigan State Housing Development Authority set up. That this is an area that we need to focus on. It's bigger than just local concern. This is where, if your county has one, a county planning commission really has a great opportunity to be the one to pull this all together. Because if you didn't know, a county planning commission, if it exists, gets all of the zoning amendments, master plan updates sent to them by statute. They have an opportunity to review those. So they can be that body to kind of coordinate and say, Township X, you're dealing with this. Township Y just dealt with it last year. Maybe you should talk. Or, oh, you're putting in a large new project here that's on the border with this community. We should check for any issues. The County Planning Commission can really play that sort of coordinating role. Because as we're looking here on this slide of all of the steps to planning process, to getting a master plan, I was just talking about this step 5 where that draft is sent to the governments, including the County Planning Commission here, getting into step 6 and 7. But what's on this slide right now is just the process for getting that master plan from the moment you go as a community, yep, we're going to start this. We need to let folks know that's a statutory requirement, to getting that research, drafting it, to final plan approval, whether it's at the planning commission or maybe your legislative body, your elected officials do that. But there is a long process here. And like I said earlier, zoning decisions that come after this are all informed by the decisions made during this planning process. So you remember to show up and engage in these early stages. Okay, so at this point, we've gone through planning process, albeit quickly. We have some more resources later on that. But we're going to turn now to our zoning primer. And the way we like to start the zoning primer is with one of the landmark United States Supreme Court cases about zoning that shows that zoning is a proper exercise of a local government's police power, their authority to regulate for the public welfare. And we talk about this village of Euclid that was in Ohio. It was just outside of Cleveland. They were kind of the test case for zoning in the United States. The Ambler Realty Company challenged their zoning ordinance because it was limiting what they would be able to do on their property. The zoning ordinance said, oh, you can't build, I think it was multifamily apartments in this particular area. So they went, the Ambler Realty Company challenged this. It went back and forth through our lower courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that, no, that zoning could be upheld. There was a legitimate governmental purpose towards protecting the public welfare by restricting what Ambler Realty could do on their land through a zoning ordinance. So this is just sort of our landmark historic one. There have been many other court cases that have proved that zoning is a constitutional use of authority. So if you hear that argument, zoning is unconstitutional, here's a good court case you can refuse to cite and say, oh, I think the Supreme Court said something different. Now, Michigan courts have talked about our state enabling statutes. These are the state laws that give the local governments the authority to zone. So we have our Planning Enabling Act, and then it's sort of partner legislation, the Zoning Enabling Act, the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act, MZEA. And this is where that authority comes from. This is where the state is passing their sovereignty, their authority through to say, all right, our subunits, our cities, our townships, our villages, our counties can do zoning as long as it's carried out as this law states. Now, getting back to that claim that some folks will say zoning is unconstitutional. Well, we just talked about the village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty. So now you know that that's nonsense. Zoning is constitutional. We have the case law to prove that. However, it is possible for some parts of zoning to be unlawful or unconstitutional. That's a big difference between saying wholesale zoning is unconstitutional or saying this particular section of a zoning ordinance is unconstitutional. And I'll give you an example of that. Zoning is constitutional, but we have free speech protections in the United States too. So you can't use zoning to regulate what somebody can write on a sign. So that particular ordinance, a zoning ordinance that says what you can or cannot write on a sign would be unconstitutional. But zoning itself is still very much a constitutional use of authority. And so I keep talking about zoning. What do I mean by that? Zoning is really just a local policy, a local regulation that governs the use of land. So most zoning ordinances are written in a way that will divide the community into various districts, outline what uses are allowed in those districts, what form those uses could take through things like setbacks or height or building size requirements or regulations. And it also tries to minimize the impact on adjacent uses, trying to prevent nuisances by putting these regulations in place. So zoning tries to regulate that long-term use of the land. There's also some things it doesn't do. It doesn't promote or oppose specific views. It's not supposed to be about private deed restrictions. Those are between private parties. The government doesn't get involved through zoning there. This isn't about the feuds between Johnny and Jimmy on the street that have been going on for years. Personal quarrels. No, this is about broader public good. We shouldn't be using it to reward or punish others. And it's not a popularity contest either. The idea is zoning establishes the rules, and then we hold people against those standards, not some sort of straw vote during the meeting to have a popularity contest to see who gets to do developments. As we think about zoning, it has some limitations that State Enabling Act put in place. So some of the general limitations we see, you can't totally prohibit a lawful use. If there's a need that's demonstrated for a lawful use, then it needs to be allowed somewhere or planned in the region, some sort of agreement going on. If something was happening and then the zoning changes, it can be continued. This is called the nonconformity. We really want to make sure we aren't doing any takings, keep maintaining that due process and equal protection under the law. So we'll have a lot of limitations put around how zoning gets implemented or done to make sure we're upholding due process and private property rights. Now, there are also a lot of limitations on what sort of uses local governments can regulate through zoning. Can't get into all the details here today, but know that MSU Extension has this resource, Restrictions on Zoning Authority, that'll let you know some of those areas like wireless communication towers or there's a whole host of things, oil and gas drilling that are areas where local governments don't have as much authority to zone. All right, so we're blazing through this and getting to the point now of you've got a master plan in your community. The zoning is established. Now the community is doing the work of making zoning decisions, sort of that day in, day out planning and zoning work. And like at the federal level, our local government divides these decisions across roughly three branches. As we see, remember back to our Schoolhouse Rock days, our executive, administrative, the legislative, and a quasi judicial branch. And we included a chart to kind of lay out the broad areas of responsibility for each of these branches, whether it's on the administrative side, like granting those permits and doing enforcement, or your legislated, your elected officials who actually adopt the plan and adopt zoning ordinance amendments. And then the planning commission is often going through and conducting hearings, making recommendations, carrying out some of the decisions laid out in the zoning ordinance. So it's really important to know where each of these decisions lie to figure out where the influence might be. And again, it comes with, as we're making those decisions, just like on the planning side, a duty to make sure we're taking in all of the perspectives for a community. So at this point, hopefully our plan has really reviewed that local data, but as communities are making decisions, they're going to have a public hearing where maybe there may be more information that can come about or more voices speaking out. Just making sure communities are always working to engage everybody, remembering that there's a bias in who participates in local government meetings. There's a bias in who gets appointed to meetings. So making sure that those groups who maybe don't have a voice at the table are still represented in the process. So if you haven't looked at a zoning ordinance before, I'm just going to give you a fair warning. They're a little bit dense and very much a reference manual, not a novel. So you're not going to read it from front end to back, but generally these are the areas we're finding in a zoning ordinance. It'll talk through where that authority comes through, and then really what you're probably most interested in are looking at the zoning districts to figure out what uses are allowed, and then some of the other areas about special use permits and things like that that we'll talk through. But what I want to spend my last little bit of time here on is really thinking through some of the decisions, those zoning decisions that get made, and where is the opportunity to engage as a member of the public. So thinking about zoning in the various districts, there'll be permitted uses. This is our A, things that are specifically listed and probably fairly easy to use in that district. Things like building a residential home in a residential district probably is a by right permitted use, we call it. It's you meet the standard, you get it. But then you may have things that are special uses. And these might have some additional considerations that might need some additional level of approval. There might be full zoning amendments, actually changing the zoning ordinance, or variances and appeals handled by the Zoning Board of Appeal. Variances are a little nuanced thing that allow some flexibility in the zoning ordinance. And then appeals are appeals to a decision made at the local level. Now, the public can influence those special uses, amendments, and variances because there's going to be hearings. It's going to be publicly noticed. On those permitted uses, less opportunity to engage, but that's because it was by design. On these other ones, though, anybody can participate and make submissions, whether it's the applicant, neighbors wishing to support or oppose, local government agencies can all become involved in those public hearings. Now, on those permits, though, these are normally done. Somebody applies to the zoning administrator and they issue or deny at sometimes same day, just based on the standards in the ordinance. So all of these decisions about what gets approved were made much further upstream for permitted decisions, that A. So that's why when we make those amendments or make those plans, it's really important to think through how is this going to play out in our community, and also making sure you're engaged early on to have a voice in these. So this sort of general land use permit, maybe it's called a zoning permit, is really just ticking the boxes. Person submits their application and all the requirements. It's checked for compliance. And there should be a list for each district for what these permitted uses are. If it's not listed, then it's not a permitted use. And this is where we get our example of applying for a permit for a house in a residential zoning district. Pretty straightforward decision there. it starts getting a little more complicated when we start bringing in some uses that might have additional things to consider. So this would be a special use permit. Sometimes this includes your planned unit developments, PUD, but this special use permit might be called a conditional use or a discretionary permit. It's for land uses which will work in that zoning district as long as we have some additional things that are met. So when we're thinking about the process here, person is still going to submit that application. It's going to be checked for completeness, but then it probably goes to the planning commission to go through those standards for a special use permit, those things that take some additional consideration at a public hearing and decide, okay, is this an appropriate place for this use based on the standards we've adopted? Again, those standards are already adopted. So these are upstream decisions. They're going to be in the zoning ordinance. And really, the idea is having the standards laid out so folks know what to expect, protecting that due process, and really thinking about uses that may have that adverse impact. If they are, okay, are there standards it could meet that would make it more appropriate? And that's what the public hearing is getting at, making that decision there. Example we often see would be a party store in a residential zoning district. Seems a little out of character, might not work, but maybe if it has some standards like a hedge or a border, some standards around its lighting, maybe it doesn't operate late at night, all these would be in a zoning ordinance, that becomes appropriate for that area. So if it meets those standards, then it would be approved. This is the key, though, with these and a lot of zoning decisions. It all comes back to the standards. We teach new planning commission members at Extension that if the standards are met, then approval must be given. So thinking through that when you're writing those standards, making those zoning ordinance amendments is key to make sure that the standards are there and then we'll be able to measure against them. And then also one of the standards is we have to notice people about these decisions. So that's how people can find out if their neighborhood is having a zoning decision being made. The standards are going to be found in a couple different places. Remember, I said zoning ordinances are like a book or like a reference book, not a novel. So this slide just lays out where you might find those various standards for a special use permit. And again, if you don't like the standards, then that's not anything about a particular project or decision happening now. If you don't like the standards, that means we need to amend the zoning ordinance. That's bigger than a particular project. Now, another type of zoning decision is called a planned unit development. This is a type of development in Michigan that allows a lot of flexibility. You can cluster things, mix uses together. Just know that it can be handled as a zoning or as a special use permit like we just talked about, or a zoning amendment like we're about to talk about. And a zoning amendment is really a change to the zoning ordinance, a change to your local law. Like we talked, zoning needs to be based on a plan. And since this is changing a law, elected officials write the law, right? So this is a legislative body decision. The elected officials, not the planning commission, are the ones who are going to be having the final say on amending an ordinance, including if it's a planned unit development amendment. When we talk about zoning amendments, it's either changing the zoning district or rezoning, changing that zoning map, or changing the text of the zoning ordinance, changing, say, what the minimum road frontage would be or how we classify a dwelling. And remember here, these changes, these are kind of global. They're at the zoning ordinance level. So this is going to change a lot for your community when you start to change the zoning ordinance. A text amendment could change a whole zoning district or even bigger areas. A map amendment, a rezoning, if we rezone a property, it means any of the uses in that new zoning district could be allowed, not just what somebody's proposing. So if somebody came and wanted to rezone and said, yes, I'm going to build a fantastic little tea store right there, get some hot tea and sit, it'll be perfect. That's great. We can rezone to commercial and allow that. But what other businesses would be allowed by a future landowner that we would then be allowing as well. And thinking about the amendment process, it's very similar to actually writing an ordinance or any other legislative process where you begin with studying and then writing the recommendations normally out of the planning commission and then beginning that amendment process. Planning commission will often hold the public hearings. Legislative bodies might as well. But all of this to say, the process is laid out. So as you think about how to engage with it, the process will be laid out for your community through the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act, through your local ordinances. Once a planning commission has a recommendation, they're going to send it up to the legislative body. There are some additional opportunities for citizens to challenge those through petitions. Encourage you, if you're thinking about that space, please work with a qualified attorney to get the advice on some of these complex processes where deadlines do apply. But eventually it's going to wind up at the legislative body for an amendment to your zoning ordinance, rezoning or text. And that legislative body is going to review it and then decide, are we going to adopt it? Maybe we need to do some more work. Maybe the legislative body doesn't like it and sends it back for further study. But going through and figuring out eventually, legislative body will come to a decision about adopting it or not, making it part of the zoning ordinance or not. And then we'll let the public know if there was that adoption. And again, option for petition to bring that to a vote for a township or county at this point in the stage. Again, encourage you to work with legal counsel on that. But for your communities, there's no shortcuts here. We're dealing with private property rights with zoning. So making sure we're following every step of the process is super important. And if we get to the end and an amendment is adopted and you're still not happy, this is where those petitions come in. But just to encourage you not to delay because there are strict deadlines on these. They need to be done within a certain amount of time. So you want to make sure you're hitting those. And then as sort of our fourth bucket of decisions that you may be able to impact in zoning realm come down to the appeals and variances. And now these are a little different. They're handled by the Zoning Board of Appeals, not the Planning Commission at the local level. But they handle some of those more nuanced, quasi-judicial, they're kind of like that local court for zoning at times, but not quite. So I wanted to make you aware that, if there are issues of interpretation or variances or wanting to appeal a decision, the Zoning Board of Appeals is likely going to be your first place to start at the local level. But really, I think for the audience today on the call, the key first point at the local level is your zoning administrator. They're the one who's responsible for making sure the zoning ordinance is complied with. They're the ones who are sometimes issuing permits, taking in applications, and also they're your local expert on your zoning ordinance. Really encourage them or encourage you if you have questions about your local zoning or when the next meeting is, call your local zoning administrator, planning zoning department, and ask. They are going to have the most up-to-date information on your particular local government. All right, so I know this was quite a lot all at once to try and get you a planning and zoning primer here in about an hour. There is a lot more to learn. Encourage you all to stay up to date. MSU Extension has lots of trainings, including a couple folks like me who work on planning and zoning around the state that may be able to help you out. We have a whole web page of planning resources. But really one of the things I want to lift up is our intensive training. If you felt like, wow, 1 hour is not enough to understand planning and zoning, you're right. We've got an 18-hour class that we can help you with. It's called Citizen Planner. It's perfect for those who are just coming into the planning and zoning world, maybe getting appointed to a local board or body. And it can be a great primer to get you a little bit deeper into these topics. Also, this slide is really key. Make a note on this one, because a lot of the content I shared today on how to engage in those decisions is in these pamphlets, our citizen education series, that are really meant to be how-to guides for residents to participate in zoning decisions at that public hearing. So if there's a special use permit or an appeal or an amendment coming in front of your local bodies, please go to these resources, give them a read. It'll sort of set the stage for that decision and how you may go preparing your comments during the public hearing. Just wanted to end with a reminder that I am not the only one doing this work for Extension. This map shows our land use educators across the state of Michigan. So we try and carve things up a little bit regionally. Please take a moment, see who your local educator is. If you want to reach out to them, they are phenomenal resources and know a lot about planning and zoning here in Michigan. So that's what I've got for our primer. I think Lindsay's got a little bit of content to bring us home on this before we take some questions that I've been seeing pop up there. So Lindsay, I've stopped my share. It should be good to go for you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Tyler, for providing that introductory information to planning and zoning. We hope that all that information for those of you on the call was really helpful to just getting a basic understanding of what zoning, planning, and land use are. So now I'm going to briefly share about how fair housing laws and housing discrimination apply to some of that basic information, very briefly. So unfortunately, it's common for the placement of affordable housing, supportive housing, and transitional housing to be contentious. NIMBY, or not in my backyard, is a term used to characterize community opposition to development proposed in a neighborhood, typically by the people who live there or live nearby. NIMBY attitudes create challenges for promoting fair housing objectives in our communities. Some examples would be ensuring equal housing opportunity and reducing segregation as some fair housing objectives. NIMBY attitudes can also impact the availability of affordable, supportive, and transitional housing in our communities. While community opposition and NIMBYism may often appear as neighbors who are just committed to protecting their neighborhoods, it can provide an avenue for housing discrimination, and we'll touch a little bit more on this. The pressure of community opposition and NIMBY attitudes towards affordable, supportive, and transitional housing can influence municipal governments to take discriminatory actions. Despite this pressure, the Fair Housing Act prohibits municipalities from making zoning and land use decisions that exclude or otherwise discriminate against individuals protected by fair housing law. When decisions about proposed housing developments are based on who is most likely intended or presumed to live there, the risk of fair housing violations increases, especially if the people who are presumed to live there are members of a protected class, and we touched on that a bit earlier. Municipal governments can't consider neighbors' fears that a member of a protected class may occupy that development that's proposed. Also, zoning ordinances cannot contain provisions that treat uses such as affordable, supportive housing or group homes for people with disabilities differently than other similar uses. And municipalities cannot enforce ordinances more strictly against housing occupied by members of a protected class. Sometimes neighbors will overtly or openly express their opposition to a proposed development based on the presumed characteristics or demographics of people they think will live there. The people who are often targeted are people of color, low-income individuals, people with disabilities, and people experiencing homelessness. Some examples of some openly discriminatory and biased statements might include, we don't want those types of people to live here. If we allow, fill in the characteristic of the person, people to live here, they will bring drugs, crime, violence. This project will attract the wrong kinds of people to our neighborhood. And our schools are good. We don't want those kids coming here and taking all of our resources. These statements are pretty open about the discriminatory intent behind them. They often rely on harmful stereotypes, fear-mongering, and the belief of the superiority of one group over the others. So those are statements we shouldn't be using as community members, just to emphasize that. There are many valid reasons for neighbors to express concerns about new developments in their neighborhood. Think traffic and parking, available infrastructure, project design, and then possible rent and cost of living increases. However, when it comes to like the discriminatory intent, when these concerns are selectively raised or disproportionately emphasized in a way that seems to target developments that are presumed to house certain groups of people, they can be indicators of covert discrimination or disguised discrimination. Sometimes the language neighbors use to express their opposition may be covert or disguised. Concerns might sound valid on their face, but they may be driven by an intent to discriminate against a member of a protected class. Neighbors might raise concerns without evidence of actual impact, or they might continue to express the same concerns even when developers and other groups of people have worked to meaningfully address those concerns. Sometimes they're used as a way to delay or block projects from happening altogether. Some examples of some of this disguised discrimination in statements would include, I'm concerned about the potential strain on our infrastructure like schools and parks. We're worried about the safety of our families with this project. This development will negatively impact our property values. This development will destroy valuable green spaces and harm local wildlife. And we need more studies to understand the potential impact of this project. Some other covert or disguised discriminatory statements might focus on concerns about character, personality, look and feel, or cultural norms of a neighborhood. Some statements might include, we need to preserve the character of our neighborhood. This new project just doesn't fit. This new development will change the character of our neighborhood. And we need to ensure that new residents adhere to our community standards. Neighborhood character can often be a coded way of referring to existing racial makeup or social norms of a predominantly white area. The statements above insinuate that new or diverse residents will somehow disrupt this character. So there's statements again that we don't want people to be using, and think critically when you hear statements like that. We want to highlight that there are some rights and responsibilities that neighbors have when there are proposed developments in their communities. This isn't a comprehensive list. These are just some examples. Neighbors have the right to learn about new housing developments and new developments in general proposed in their neighborhood, and they also have the right to ask questions to address real concerns about projects and their impact on their communities. Neighbors also have the right under the First Amendment to speak for or against proposed developments. They also have the right to file a lawsuit to block a development, but just note that lawsuits cannot be based on an illegal motive, lack a reasonable basis in law or fact, or have an illegal objective. And also another thing to note is that frivolous lawsuits that are filed to delay a project or drive up costs are not protected by the First Amendment and may violate the Fair Housing Act. Neighbors do not have the right to block construction or trespass, to slow or halt development of a project, and they don't have the right to harass new residents. Discrimination in land use and zoning and NIMBY attitudes can have a lot of harmful impacts on our communities. Here's a whole list of them. Some examples include blocking needing housing development. We're in an affordable housing crisis, and we do need housing development. And so when we block those opportunities, we have less housing available to us. These attitudes can also perpetuate and maintain segregation in our neighborhoods. They can also contribute to stigmatization and perpetuating harmful stereotypes about particular groups of people. In a time when we have a lot of challenges to address in our communities, these attitudes can keep us divided and separate from unifying to work towards the solutions, collaborative solutions. These attitudes can also overburden some communities with the task of providing services and amenities to more people. And there's so many other implications outside of the ones on this slide. So with that, I think that is all for us today. I wanted to point out that we have an upcoming session in June that's kind of like a second part to this series, it's really focused on action and what we can do moving forward after we have this base knowledge information about planning, zoning, and fair housing. Um, so now I think we'll take some time to answer some questions people have.
Yeah,
All right.
will say I did. Oh, good. And Bree put an answer in the question box too about more on the history of planning and zoning as a tool for exclusion. So got some webinars there, and we'll also recommend the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein and its sequel Just Action by Richard and his daughter about implementation of that book as great resources to learn more there. But
Yeah, thank
take it
you,
away.
Tyler. Yeah, so there was a question that someone asked about, the history, especially with exclusionary and redlining and things. Tyler did put a link for MSU's information, and then our last series on how our housing development series also did cover that history as well. For people interested in that, feel free to check that out. We had some really good questions. So thank you for those that have submitted them. So Tyler, we have a question here about how we can facilitate these processes so more people can show up and participate because some people within our communities may not be able to due to jobs, transportation, access, the list goes on. So how can we help people participate more at these planning meetings? Because there are people that want to participate, and I think that's important that we provide them that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No, and that's the question was asking a lot of those great thoughts to have at the local level. Each local government gets a lot of flexibility in how they handle this. So I'll start this answer though with a reminder, and I have a colleague who's really good about making this distinction between public engagement on the planning side of planning and zoning, sort of that master plan, setting the goals, the vision, and then the public engagement that happens at the very end, right before a decision is made at that public hearing, the sort of final piece. So at that final piece, the public hearing, that's really designed to make sure the decision makers have all the information they need. So it's important to make sure those nearby neighbors are getting there, submitting the written comments, and getting the engagement there is key, but it's just to make sure that everybody has the right data to make that decision. Where I think it's a little more important to think about that broader perspective and involving as many people as possible is on the planning side, that really upstream portion of it, where we're setting the goals, the visions, and all of those things in the master plan that are going to influence all of the decisions later. So on that planning side, we get some more flexibility. This doesn't have to be at a official government meeting at 7 o'clock p.m. No, you can involve people at all sorts of different opportunities, meeting them where they already are on that planning process to engage them. We saw this get sort of a shot in the arm during the pandemic with increased online engagement and sort of online planning processes and charrettes and things that happened. But I live in Cass County. Internet can be hit or miss here. So we have to think about what are those other things. And this is where having that local expertise and broad perspective on like planning commissions and local advisory boards is really important because there are lots of low hanging fruits. You can, if you have a community survey for your master plan, yeah, maybe some folks will get it online. I bet you more will do it if you show up at the county fair or show up outside the grocery store or start showing up where people are. You want to know what people's thoughts are on renewable energy or housing in your community? Go to the Friday night football game and ask people there. Is this where are the people already at? And really continually asking yourself, how do we reach them in ways that are going to be less of a burden on them, but also the local community? If I go to a county fair to get information, I'm not planning a whole event. I'm not organizing a space, doing all of that work. I can focus more on that engagement. So really thinking about that. Other great strategies we've seen communities use using peers. So City of Grand Rapids, I think, has a great program about getting folks already involved in their neighborhood looped into the planning process, taking those existing community leaders and bringing them in. So lots of great ways to get folks more involved and just opening up that communication. It's going to vary for each community, but yeah, that's what I've got. Have you guys seen anything interesting?
I think Those are all great recommendations. I think, as you mentioned, going where the people are, and I think things like this, spreading awareness about it. Maybe many folks may not know that they have the power to do so. So, word of mouth, um, and even that, I think advocating to um, your local community on that you want to be engaged, and here are the barriers. And if you have solutions, I think suggesting them. I think they knowing some of our planning folks, they are interested and they understand there are barriers and they're trying to mitigate those. So if you had suggestions, I would always recommend, providing those to your community.
Fun one that I saw. There's a community that when a rezoning is happening, they put a notice on a yard sign in the property. And
Oh,
so anybody who's walking by who might not get the newspaper, might not go on the municipal website, they can still know that something in their world might be changing and get the information on how to get engaged. So
yeah. And I do want to make note, there are some of these questions are really detailed, and so we can only go as far as we can in the time that we have. But some of these questions are very detailed and really great, and things that we may consider for our next session to maybe incorporate. So this next question. Is how can we facilitate? Oh, sorry, that's the one we just did. Can we elaborate on, or can you elaborate on the how to equitably address community blight laws as this person's heard that they could be weaponized to by people to exclude and displace people from their community?
yeah, on that one, the question about using these blight laws, I think not necessarily a blight law, but a way that I've seen other ordinances used to create more housing equity. A community near me was really hesitant to have rentals allowed under their zoning in some districts. They had a real sour taste about rentals and what they were seeing in neighboring communities with the quality of what was getting built for that. And so what they ended up doing was pairing, allowing these rental multifamily units with a rental ordinance that would make sure some minimum standards for health, safety, and welfare were met. And that got to the point where then that community was able to go through with some of those zoning reforms to allow more choice and variety with these additional standards from another ordinance in place. With the blight laws, what I'll say on that, just sort of touching broadly, is that it really comes down to what is the goal of this ordinance and how is it being implemented, right? Any ordinance can be taken to that level of being weaponized if done by the right malicious individual. So I think it really gets back to that goals and visions, right? What is the goal and vision for this blight ordinance? Is it to meet a, minimum health and welfare standard? Or maybe we going above that and getting into regulating aesthetics for a reason that maybe gets beyond our, rational governmental interest here, and having those conversations about what is the goal often I find helps illuminate some of these local ordinances and how to make sure we're getting that community that we've envisioned out of it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And we are coming up on the time. So we have two more questions. They're both pretty detailed. And one of them kind of covers explicitly racial zoning being deemed unconstitutional. So this may be a little confusing, but I'll read it as is. I thought that explicitly racial zoning was unconstitutional, but when zoning wasn't explicitly used as a tool to racially segregate people, then it was okay. Is this an incorrect understanding? And then it goes on to say, also, don't some people tend to say zoning is unconstitutional because of disparate impact on racially marginalized people, which isn't necessarily explicit, tends to be facially neutral, but can have an impact regardless. Is this an incorrect understanding? I don't
So
know if you
hopefully,
on that.
yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully folks are able to read that on our Q&A panel if you want to follow along. But broadly, yes, explicitly racist zoning was deemed unconstitutional. That was a Buchanan versus Worley, a 1920s Supreme Court decision, I believe. So yes, that is constitutional. And when it gets to that uh, impact, that's where we start getting into our fair housing laws and that space. So yes, whether or not it's strict constitutional, the case that I was talking about, Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, was more on a due processes, private properties case is what they were raising a lot there. But here, when it gets into understanding the nuances of it's all broadly not allowed, but where that authority for not allowing it comes from is where the nuance comes in a little bit. So hopefully that helps clear it up some. Yes, some getting to the Constitution. I don't know offhand of a like case law to point to where it's just where we are expressly talking about that disparate impact on marginalized races to say, yes, here is your citation for that. But I encourage you to check out those webinars we linked earlier too for more on that broader history of exclusionary policies there.
Thank you. And then we have one more here. We'll take this one because we are at the time. So if folks need to log off, yeah, feel free. We just have this one more question. And then we will be done for the evening or the afternoon, sorry. Can a concern over infrastructure ever be a valid concern? For instance, if a high density area with resources and infrastructure already stretched thin is being zoned for higher density, while excluding a single family zoned area for higher density zoning. Could this be a sincere and valid concern of those neighborhoods? I think we've primarily heard this when it comes to already high density areas being considered easier to build more density on rather than taking up the challenge of convincing single family zones to zone for higher density. That is yeah, so feel free to read that in the chat over if that got a little wordy for you.
It got a little wordy, and I'm always hesitant to speak to the specifics about a community's plan or the decisions they're making because I do not know the nuances. But with this, I'll say just broadly, yeah, infrastructure is a concern. This is the reality of our built environment. I don't think anybody could say it's going to be a wise decision to build the 6-story apartment building in my rural Volenia township where we have septic and that's it. So thinking about infrastructure is really key. And again, it comes on that sort of planning. In addition to the land use, a little known thing that planning commissions do is they plan capital improvement projects for a community too. By state law, your community's long-term planning for infrastructure spending lives with the planning commission as sort of a starting point. So it's meant to be that coordinating point to really think through in terms of that vision we set out, what do we need to do to accomplish that, both from the infrastructure perspective and all the other ones we talked about today. So yes, infrastructure is definitely a concern. I always hear about it from communities. It is a reality of our world. So it's about really thinking through what that infrastructure is, what those capacities are, and that involves people that are a lot smarter than Tyler figuring out what your wastewater facility can hold and sewage and all of that. But it can be an issue, and that's where that local facts book at the front part of a master plan comes in. It can really explain what that infrastructure situation is and use those data to then build the decisions about how we're going to build this community out. If we're reaching capacity in an area, knowing that what the situation on the ground is helps then plan for, okay, do we increase capacity? Do we spread out to other places? These are all big decisions that a community makes and why it's so important to be involved in that upstream planning process that sets them out.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. And I think also kind of tying back to the fair housing aspect, if that is a concern, however, it is addressed and by the developers or by the zoning by the whoever is in the commission meetings, if that's addressed and people are still pushing back on that, that could be have some fair housing concern if we're thinking it's because of the certain people that are going to be living there, those types of things. So there are valid concerns, as Tyler mentioned, about infrastructure, but if those uh, concerns are addressed, then then what is the actual reason that someone may be concerned with that
And
development going there.
this is really one of the tricky roles that those appointed officials, your planning commissioners, have to play is taking in all of that information from the community and deciding what rises to the level of a fact for this decision. What is the actual reality we're dealing with here and making that decision, not based on who comes to that particular meeting and says a lot, but based on all of the research and everything we know in totality, figuring out what those facts are and agreeing on them and then making a decision according to the standards.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, so that was all our questions for today. Thinking about that, I don't know why I want to be on a planning commission board. Sounds like a lot of decisions that I don't want to have to make.
It's very fun. It's very fun. I encourage everybody, get involved with your local government.
Um, but thank you so much, Tyler. We really appreciate you being here today and discussing, this intro level. As Lindsay mentioned, we do have a second session, which Tyler will be joining us back for, where we'll kind of go into more of the engagement and the participation process. So this was really to set folks up to that intro level understanding, and then that participation engagement portion. Tyler will join us back, so feel free to register for that. And with that all being said, have a good rest of your afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. Take care, everyone.